Welcome to the, well, I'm sorry. Hello, welcome to our podcast. This is İlhan Taner. Today, we have a guest, very important guest, important reporter, Chuck Ross, is a reporter at the Daily Caller. Chuck is a well-known reporter with his relentless reporting on many issues nationally in the US, but specifically in recent times on the various parts of the Mueller investigation. But why Chuck Ross is on Turkey-focused news site Ahval's podcast today? For those who do not know, Chuck was the first reporter who broke the very important story which was a very important story for America, but also a very important story for Turkey, and we are going to talk about it today. Welcome to the show, Chuck. I am very delighted to have you here today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
So a few days after the 2016 presidential election, you broke that story in which you reported the fact that Mike Flynn, then not a White House official, but one of the most important consequential actors within the Trump campaign, was actually a lobbyist for a Turkish businessman, Flynn-Alptekin, who has close ties to the Turkish government. Flynn was, those days, had a very important Turkish related column appeared on the Hill website, in which he fiercely argued that the Erdogan government should be treated like a real ally and his arch enemy Fethullah Gülen should be extradited to Turkey. So my first question, you broke this Flynn-Alptekin story first. It has been little over 2 years. Can you tell us any details? How did you come across that story? That story found you, or it was, if I was a jury on any journalism award, that you would be my candidate for that award. I'm just wondering, how did you broke that story?
Well, thanks for saying that. The truth is, and I'm glad you've asked it, I've not really been able to talk much about it. I haven't really been on many interviews to discuss this, so I'm very happy to, because I've been accused of all sorts of things, especially on Twitter. I've had a lot of people coming after me saying that I'm a secret Gülenist and all of these things. What actually happened, and if I can back up maybe a year from before I reported this. So 2015, when Hillary Clinton was, it was apparent that, she was going to become the Democratic front runner here in the U.S. I looked through her donor list and found a couple of major Gulen supporters here in the U.S. who had donated to her Clinton Foundation. So I did a story on that. It was apparent to me, and I'm by no means an expert on Turkish politics, so I don't want to try to portray myself that way. But it became apparent to me that the Gulen issue would become a pretty hot button issue over the course, going forward. I had a good sense that Erdogan would continue, trying to gain Gulen's extradition and all of these things. So in 2015, I report this story about donations to the Clinton Foundation. And then fast forward to the coup. Obviously, the Erdogan and AKP forces and everything started really pushing the Gulen was behind that. And then, the Michael Flynn op-ed appears out of nowhere on November 8th, 2016. I saw that, and I knew that Flynn was very likely going to be either defense secretary or national security advisor or some high-level position in the Trump administration. So I saw this op-ed, struck me as very strange because Flynn had not been out publicly saying anything on the coup. Well, he had, we found out later, but he was by no means a Gulen foe. He's not been on the record at all talking about Gulen or anything like that. And so when you see an op-ed or a piece like that pop up out of nowhere, you start to wonder, where is this coming from? Why is he all of a sudden interested in this? And so to kind of quell any rumors that have been pressed to me, nobody provided me the information on this. I saw the op-ed and I decided to do a simple search of lobbying records here in the U.S. That are filed with the Senate. And I saw that Flynn Intel Group, General Flynn's consulting firm, had done work for something called Innovo BV. And the lobbying records are very vague on what Innovo was. So I did another one more step or two, and I decided to look at business records over in the Netherlands where Innovo is registered. And lo and behold, I find that Alptekin was the sole proprietor of that organization. And then, so all of these kind of interesting little pieces, you start to question, why is a Dutch company hiring Michael Flynn, and why is a Turkish citizen, a guy who with links to, he's in the Turkish-US Business Council, why is he hiring Flynn through a Dutch company? So by that point, this is a couple of days after the op-ed, it became apparent that, there was something interesting going on. But I'll be honest, at the time, I did not know the full scope of what would come of this. I had no idea that it would turn into a pretty big scandal where, Flynn was paid hundreds of thousands of dollars, and there was this massive attempt to extradite Gulen. I just knew at the time that it was very interesting and very peculiar. So I decided to, investigate it, and that's where we are.
Thank you for the story. I didn't know this way, and this was apparently very important investigative journalism we see here. So Flynn-Alptekin was talking to you and many other reporters, including myself, in those days. He was answering every single question and text and messages and all that. And turned out to be many of the things he was telling those days and weeks not true. When you are looking back now, why he was so talkative in those weeks and months, what he was trying to achieve with this, what was his strategy then?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And you and I could probably compare notes here on what all lies he told us in those early days. I've kind of lost track of all of them. As far as the strategy, my only guess, and I really don't know, but my only guess is he just wanted his story out in the public so that his, what we call them, co-conspirators, they could line up their stories. We have Bijan Kiong, who is the other indicted, he's indicted in this with Flynn-Intel Group. So maybe and also the indictment that came out recently, if you look, a lot of the things that he told you and I and other reporters match up with what the government found he was lying about. And they also match up with some of the lies, or alleged lies, we should say, that Bijan Kiong was telling, or that told investigators. So looking back, and this is just a guess, like I said, it just looks like they were trying to align their stories, and the best way for Kim to do that would be to get out into the public eye and tell his version of events. And so as far as the lies or inconsistencies he told, the ones that I can recall off the top of my head, he initially claimed that the contract with Flynn-Intel Group was in the tens of thousands of dollars rather than in the hundreds of thousands of dollars that we found out it actually was. He claimed that it had to do with his initiative for a Israeli energy company, Ratio Oil. He said that he was trying to investigate the U.S. business climate, and the Gulen issue was part of that. And he was ultimately doing that. He hired Flynn so that he could secure a contract for this Israeli energy company. And by all appearances, it looks like that was just a ruse, that was not the reason he hired Flynn-Intel. He also downplayed, to me, definitely, he downplayed his links to the Turkish government. I remember he told me a couple of weeks after I initially reported my article, well, first of all, he tried to pull on my heartstrings by telling me that, Gülenists had threatened his family and all of these things. And he's selling a sob story, kind of trying to make me feel bad for him. But he also, he claimed that he did not have any close links to the Turkish government. He also said that he was, a very harsh critic of Erdogan, and that he did not support a lot of Erdogan's policies. So we come to find out that, he was in constant contact with top Turkish government officials while he was working on this Flynn project. So those are just a few of the ones I can think of off the top of my head. You could probably remember more than I do, but he was definitely selling a story that now looks completely fabricated.
So after this indictment released and Flynn-Alptekin was named as defendant, he came out in a couple days later in Turkish. I don't think he wrote in English in these tweets. And he said that, well, I was just going after Fethullah Gülen. Fethullah Gülen and Gülen community known as one of our main actor behind the coup attempt. This is the Turkish government's accusations. There are tens of thousands of people in Turkey right now in jail. Flynn-Alptekin and many others on Twitter, you probably also came across. The question is, so what is the problem? Flynn-Alptekin was hiring a lobbyist from or within the Trump campaign. What is wrong with that? Doesn't everybody do the same thing in the U.S.?
Yeah. So I guess the first problem with it is that, they were doing the bidding of the Turkish government. They were working on behalf and to the benefit of the Turkish government to send back, a foe of Erdogan. And just U.S. law requires that if you are working on to benefit another government, that you have to register your work with the Justice Department to declare that you are a foreign agent. Plenty of lobbyists and consultants register their work. Robert Amsterdam, who does a lot of work for the Turkish government, he regularly registers his lobbying activity. So basically, so that the public is aware. When you hear of someone like General Flynn promoting a cause on behalf of the Turkish government, it would be good and ideal to know beforehand what his agenda is and why he's making certain claims. Because, without that disclosure, you have a respected general who it seems like is adopting a position, and it's just good for the American public to know what their agenda is and who's paying them to say and advance certain causes. So, and then the other aspect, and there's been no charge of espionage or treason or anything of that sort. But if we look at it, the kind of big picture, you have Flynn, who signed a $600,000 contract with a cutout for the Turkish government, and then Trump is elected. So essentially, what we had was in the form of General Flynn, we have someone who was on the Turkish government's payroll, who would then, he entering the U.S. government, and he was somewhat beholden to Flynn-Alptekin and other people. Once General Flynn got into the government, since he had not disclosed that he was working for the Turkish government, that's a huge piece of, we could say that they could blackmail him with that information. So that poses another risk, kind of to the national security interests of the U.S. So there are a lot of different parts to this, a lot of different reasons why it's wrong. Some of them are legal reasons. Others, I would say, are more ethical, not necessarily illegal, but unethical. There's a lot going on there.
About that indictment, about 20-page long indictment, how did you find the indictment? Was it, American prosecutors, in your view, had a good amount of information? Was it a good prepared indictment, or what was the most striking part for you?
I think the most striking part is that if you read, well, you didn't even have to read it too closely. It's just pretty obvious that General Flynn provided a lot of information that was used to indict Alptekin and Bijan-Kian. Flynn is not named, he's not identified by name, but a few days before the indictment came out, there was some memorandum released in Flynn's case before Robert Mueller, where Mueller disclosed that Flynn had provided substantial assistance in other investigations. And so Mueller did not name what investigations Flynn was helping with, but it was sort of obvious that he was helping with the Turkish lobbying investigation. So when this indictment comes out, when it came out and you read through it, the level of detail in there, it's pretty clear that Flynn gave a ton of information to prosecutors to go after, his former business partners. And, the interesting details when you go into the facts laid out in the indictment, it mentions Bijan-Kian and Hikmet Alptekin's interactions with Turkish government officials. That was not specifically known, that they were in direct contact as often as is laid out in the indictment. Also, and going back to some of Hikmet's lies, he told me, and I'm sure he may have told you, I'm sure he's told other reporters, that his this September 19th, 2016 meeting at the UN General Assembly with a couple of Turkish government officials and others with Flynn Intel, Hikmet said that just kind of happened spur of the moment. That was not planned out. But when you read the indictment, it's clear that they had planned this meeting weeks in advance. So this was part of Flynn Intel Group's efforts to extradite Gulen. This was a orchestrated meeting at the UN General Assembly. So there are a lot of very interesting details in that indictment. It kind of confirms a lot that has been reported, but it also fills in the gaps in a few places.
So it was a sentencing hearing for Mike Flynn, I think 2 weeks ago, and it was postponed, and it was reported that Mike Flynn is going to cooperate with American investigators. So it is understood that he will cooperate more, he'll give more information. Is this your understanding? And if it is so, what else we can learn on this Flynn-Alptekin Turkish lobbying and Turkish government situation?
Yeah, that is my understanding. In this hearing a week or so ago, the judge I was not there in the room, but reading other reporters' view of it, the judge was very upset, seemed upset with Flynn's work on behalf of the Turkish government. He seemed to be very critical of that. And so Flynn decided during that sentencing hearing that he would delay that pending his cooperation in the case against Bijan-Kian and Hikmet Alptekin. So what that means is that Flynn if this case heads to trial, if Kian doesn't plead guilty, if he decides to go to trial, that means that Flynn could very well appear at trial. And if he appears at trial, then we could assume that he will reveal all sorts of details about how the work for Alptekin came about, details of their conversations, details of their payment arrangements. Another thing I haven't brought up is the reference to kickback payments from Bijan-Kian to Hikmet. They paid $80,000 back to Hikmet Alptekin. And so one thing we don't know is whether the Turkish government was aware of that. That would be interesting to find out. We also don't know if Michael Flynn was aware of that. So we could expect that if this does go to trial, that Flynn would be called as a witness, and all sorts of details will be provided. There are also other Flynn Intel Group employees who would likely be called. There is a former FBI official, very high-ranking FBI official named Brian McCauley, who worked for Flynn Intel Group, and he worked on this Gulen project. He would likely be called. He was appointed, actually, kind of a side note, he was appointed to his position at the FBI in, I believe, 2011 by Robert Mueller, when Robert Mueller was FBI director. So he's close with Robert Mueller. So we can assume that he provided some substantial information about this whole operation. He'd likely testify as well. So, if this goes to trial, we can expect a lot of interesting information to come out.
Do you see it as it is likely this will go to trial, in your opinion?
Yeah, I really don't know. Because I definitely am not a legal expert at all, and I guess typically it seems like most people in federal cases, they find a way to plead. So we could probably a decent chance that Bijan Kian will accept a guilty plea to avoid a harsher sentence. So if that's the case, then this won't go to trial. But there will still be other details that will be released through that whole process. If I had to guess, I would say that Kian will take a guilty plea, but I really don't know. I don't have any insight into that at this point.
I think so far he pled not guilty.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah, he can change his plea. So since you broke this very important story a little over 2 years, you have exposed to the Turkish politics more, and you already mentioned that some people are calling you Gülenist. Welcome to the club. And you have been writing stories, Turkey-related stories, time to time, some lobbying stories in other issues. And you were also targeted, as we understand, by some pro-Erdogan quarters. What is your understanding of the Turkish media landscape? And if you can do some kind of comparisons for us with the American media landscape.
Yeah, that's and I as far as being targeted by people accusing me of being Gülenist and all of these things, that happened a lot on Twitter. I had a ton of people, anonymous accounts, coming after me and accusing me of various things, and that seemed, well, that's gone away. And I don't know if that's because whoever is behind that type of thing has reallocated their resources and they're no longer doing that, or if it's because I've just not covered this particular case as much over, since it's kind of died down over the past year. But it was definitely an interesting experience, having a lot of accounts and people coming after me, accusing me of things just because they didn't like my story. As far as comparing to, it's hard for me to compare just because, like I said earlier, I cannot claim to be at all an expert on Turkish politics or even Turkish media. I know that it seems to me as an outsider looking in that, here in America, we do have this struggle between the mainstream press and other, outsider type press organizations. And there's this constant fight over fake news, what's propaganda. At least in the Turkish media landscape, I know for me reading translations of Turkish media coverage, it's hard to know who is telling the truth and who isn't, if that makes sense. It's kind of because AKP and Erdogan control so much of the media that you read a story and you really just don't know what's true and what's not. For instance, you may have written about this on your website last year. But when Alptekin when it was reported that he was interviewed by Mueller's team, I believe one of the outlets reported that, and it kind of got picked up, but I didn't know for sure. I didn't know whether or not that story was accurate, because I didn't know if someone writing it was trying to maybe promote an agenda to either smear Alptekin or what. So it kind of, as an American covering Turkish events, it's hard for me to know what's what. That happens here too, covering American events, but I know there is it's a little bit more complicated in Turkey. Yeah, it's been interesting learning how the different factions, Turkish media landscape, as well as all the different factions involved in the, kind of debating the Gulen issue, and also Flynn and Alptekin and all of those things.
Okay, I hope you continue reporting on Turkey-related issues. Again, you broke this story. I still remember where I was when I read your story. I was walking to the DuPont Circle, and I was really stunned to see Mike Flynn was a lobbyist whose column just published, as we all know now, a couple of days ago. And actually, it was promoted for the first time on Turkish TV on the eve of the election by Flynn-Alptekin, and Flynn-Alptekin, showing this, that Trump being elected is a good thing for Turkey because his likely national security advisor is thinking this. This was how he was promoting that column. Then later on turned out to be the column that was advised. Well, thank you so much. I don't know if there is anything else we have not touched. Please tell us if there is another point you would like to make. Otherwise, this was a great conversation, and I learned how you broke that story. I think this is the first time also being reported here.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me on to talk about it. I think the only thing that I didn't dive into, and I kind of meant to address it before, but I am fascinated by, and I'm sure you are too, the whole Turkish lobbying mechanism, the way they try to implement it here in the U.S. I've covered also the whole Russian, what Mueller's focusing on, the Russian infiltration efforts in America and the American electoral system. Looking at the Turkish lobbying, it's just interesting how many different firms have been employed, how a lot of it is overlaps with each other. We have Ikim, who has worked in the past with Mercury Public Affairs. Mercury Public Affairs is also embroiled sort of in the Mueller investigation because they worked with Paul Manafort, the former Trump campaign chairman. So I guess one thing that has been very interesting to see come out over the last 2 years, I guess the whole Flynn situation kind of helped expose some of the other the Turkish lobbying efforts and the different ways that they employ some of these lobbying firms to try to, essentially, their main focus is to get Gulen extradited, and they've gone to great lengths to try to make that happen. And during the course of that, they've kind of showed their hand a lot and kind of the ways they'll go about trying to do that. And obviously the government, Mueller, and the Justice Department here has started taking a closer look at foreign lobbying. And so that's kind of all come together at this same time. And so we see a lot of how this works. So it's been interesting covering that. And I'm sure that me, a lot of us will be able to continue covering this in the near future.
I am very curious if we'll see more of some Turkish lobbying and Russian lobbying. There will be more connection points, or this is it. We have already seen a lot, because the Turkish lobbying in Washington, D.C. got very interesting in recent years since this big fight with the Gülenists. Mm-hmm. Gülenists were the main arm of the Turkish government lobbying in D.C. till 2014. So since then, this new So we will see if we will learn more of Turkey, Russia, lobbying coordination in Washington, D.C. Again, thank you so much for coming on today. This was a honor. This was a pleasure, great pleasure. And I hope to talk to you in the future again.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too.